Hey everybody, welcome back to CoopCouchGaming, all you Coop operatives out there, as well as anybody else that wants to join me here on the good old couch today. So, this might be a little bit different, just going to put that out there. Yeah, so it's certainly not going to be, yeah, this video is definitely not the norm, of what, I usually do, as well as, what we usually do here at CoopCouchGaming. And also, the title of this video, probably by the end, it's probably going to be wrong, simply because I'll probably just end up with like at least like 100 comments just literally roasting me and directing me to exactly the game that I'm trying to talk about and plan to talk about today. But yeah, that being said, yeah, there's been a bit of a game that I've had on my mind lately from my childhood, and I cannot for the life of me remember what the ding dang game name is. Or like what, like, I cannot remember, man. But yeah, so there's a strategy, real-time strategy game, much like the game that we have right here in front of us. Also, Age of Empires, solid game. Just gonna say, man, still been playing it, and have played it for a very long time. That's what I'm gonna say. But yeah, so the game that I want to talk about, it's a real-time strategy game. I used to play it when I was a kid, so this was like early 2000s. But I cannot remember much about it, nor does it seem like anybody else remembers much about it. And I've like been trying to bring it up, and been trying to find stuff online, to try to unravel this. Like, it's like, where did this game go? I know that it exists, right? It's like I've searched, I have some talking points, but but yeah, I've searched far and wide, on the internet, going to different forums and Reddits and such, that discuss like RTS games, other like forgotten gems in gaming, things like that. And it seems like nobody knows what I'm talking about here. Here's the thing though, I know that it does exist. Like I played it. I remember enough about it to where I'm pretty sure I know what I'm talking about here. But yeah, more or less, like, I wanted to address the topic today and bring it up to the channel here to see if anybody knows what this game might be. And more or less just confirm that I'm not crazy for remembering a game that doesn't exist. Okay, just, sort of getting into it. I mean, here's the thing, I don't even know the name of the game. For some reason though, I've got three words that kind of come to mind when it comes to like the title of it: sword, spell, and frontier. So I don't know if it's maybe like sword and spell, or like frontier of swords and spells, or like something like that. But I mean, looking up online, I didn't find anything in that regard. We'll go into the naming schematics later down the road here, but yeah. Yeah, more or less. Yeah, I have no idea what I'm trying to find. It's like, I think I go down certain rabbit holes with it, and I think I find something, then it turns out to be a different game that I've never played. You know what I mean? But yeah, moving on. To cover the basics, it was an RTS game that had a very simplistic interface. Maybe even one, I mean, if I had to guess, it was probably either like late 80s, early 90s. Where like the screen is basically, it just shows a bunch of icons instead of like graphics, and favors static imagery over like animated stuff like you see here. You figure in comparison, Age of Empires, well, this is Age of Empires 2. I mean, this game was originally 1999, so yeah, it would have been earlier than this, for sure, but more or less, like, you're presented with a grid of squares that contain units and resources. Different icons for those. There's also two different kinds of units. There's kind of like a breakdown of each as well, but we can get into that later. I remember there were workers, which were responsible for gathering up like the different materials and like spell crystals, whatever they were called, right? In each square, as part of that grid that I had mentioned. And then you also had like unit types that were warriors who would go out and attack other players' villages, or in case, AI villager, mostly AI, right? But you would send them out and attack different villages and cities, of your opponents, right? And the only way that you could really interact with your own villages is to send warriors along with some amount of workers to like fight against whoever's currently occupying it. So like if you wanted to interact with an enemy village, like you would send your troops to go attack it, obviously, which allows you to capture it. You're not necessarily like destroying it. But I believe that if you manage to take over a player's town without fighting them, though, like if they pulled back their people and their their armies and such, I think that they were rewarded some bonus points. So I remember sometimes it was actually better to make like a strategic retreat than to actually stay and have like all your people just kind of wiped out, right? But yeah, all of this sounds pretty straightforward so far, but after thinking about it more carefully, it does, that does mean that there, like, from what I recall, there wasn't any like building like you would do in this game. Every time that you wanted to actually build like something new, you needed to deploy armies to go and clear out like existing structures before you could like basically claim that land and then utilize that. You know what I mean? The game itself also looked fairly realistic for its age, albeit it was a bit bland compared to most modern games, obviously, especially when you compare it to something like this. Granted, this is also the definitive edition, but I mean, even back in the day, like Age of Empires 2 always had solid graphics. This game that I'm thinking of, not quite as much. Not quite as much that, yeah. But I do believe, let me think. Let me look through here. But yeah, the landscape mostly consisted of grayish colors and trees. And the trees weren't, like, there weren't very many trees or anything like that. So overall, the game kind of felt rather dull. But I remember, like, once you start getting further into the game and can start using, like, the magic effects, like the different spells and such, that tended to give it a little bit more life. It made the game feel a lot busier than what it was. Everything also had sort of like a darker tint to it. It was like basically almost like pixel art, like you would see done just like real quick in like MS Paint or something similar. You know what I mean? And again, if this was back in the like early 90s, I mean, the graphics were going to be relatively primitive to begin with, but the game itself was also entirely like black, white, or like grayscale. However, since everything looked so much alike, it didn't really matter how, like, I guess ugly the map looked. It kind of had like that, like, weird, sort of like pleasant to look at appearance, despite kind of how basic it was. It also didn't really help that the game is old, of course, and there wasn't really a way to like change the appearance of anything in game. That being said, you could actually customize. You had hero units, and you could customize their clothing, their armor, and I think you could even change some elements of their hair, and possibly add some tattoos and stuff like that. I can't remember. But, I mean, a mechanic like that now doesn't sound that impressive, but I remember back in the day, like, that wasn't something that you really saw, you know what I mean? So that was actually pretty impressive back in the day. I mean, given the limitations that some of these games had to work with, right? But yeah, speaking of heroes, one hero in particular that I remember more than the others, it was a martial hero, like a melee hero, named Krogan. He was a barbarian-looking fellow with a long beard, two-handed axe, like battle axe that he would hold in his little icon. In addition, he had a skill, and this is why that I played him mostly. It's because he had a skill that would increase the damage output of like any of your melee combatants that are currently readied up. And we'll go into that mechanic later. Another unique feature of his is the ability to summon a giant wolf to aid him in battle, which was a very, very, like, it was faster than some of the, like, faster units that you could make. So it was pretty good. It didn't last for very long though. I remember you could basically just bring them into battle and then just have them rush towards like more or less the enemy back line, and that was, you know, more or less the extent of it. Can't exactly tell you. Yeah, I mean, other than that character, I can't really say too much about the others. There's a couple of others that come to mind, but we can get those later. But yeah, maybe some of them, yeah, they did have skills of their own, but I don't really recall having played them too much to be able to really tell you one way or the other. But yeah, I was also not able to really find anything concerning the name Krogan when I did research into it, other than a couple of banking companies and plumbing groups that popped up online, which really didn't help to didn't really help that much when it came to trying to figure out what this game was, to be honest with you. So throughout the rest of my talking points today, I'll be, you know, as you can see, like yeah, as you can see here, for the majority of what I'll be doing today, I'm going to be using an AI art generator thing that I'd found in order to try to like replicate or kind of reconstruct roughly what these icons would have looked like. I mean, granted, they would have been even more so primitive compared to what is currently being displayed, but I figured that might help kind of like jog some memories perhaps, because I know, like, you know, just trying to describe it and then, you know, picture it off of nothing, you know, it's kind of hard, you know, so I figured that might be a little bit useful as we continue here. But yeah, I'll be using it, you know, similarly throughout the rest of the components that we look at here. Hopefully be able to, like I said, you know, trigger the, you know, the memories of this game that other people surely have, you know what I mean? But yeah, if you've liked the video so far, we definitely appreciate it if you were to like the video and subscribe and become a good old Coop operative today. Yeah, join all the other Coop operatives here. But that being said, now really the only information I can provide on like the gameplay mechanics, and we're gonna be talking about that next. Go ahead and discuss the gameplay itself. But yeah, more or less are kind of summed up in the following points. So, number one, you start off each round by picking either workers or warriors. You could pick a certain number of them determined at the start of the game. Both of them are used throughout the course of the game, you know, in different ways. And I already touched briefly on it, but we'll get into it now. Number two, each unit type, so either worker or warrior, has its own strengths and weaknesses depending on like the target goal, like what you're trying to accomplish that playthrough. However, since every single player kind of has access to the same units and overall starting setup, nobody really has like an advantage over anyone else, unless like you obviously like make some kind of like a terrible decision. Also, there, you know, there is something to be said as far as like trying to balance out between deploying like armies that are big enough to hold your village, but small enough to where if you do send them out to avoid like detection by any like enemy scouts or any forward units that they have. More or less it's a game of like trying to act without being caught, basically. But yeah, I do believe that there's some way to increase production speeds for troops as well, so that more resources can be produced as well per, you know, unit of time spent on stuff. But this also comes at the cost of increasing losses in battles, because the number of troops deployed has also, of course, increased. You know, more resources means more troops, means more losses. And that can play a mechanic later, because there is sort of like a morale system involved. So sometimes having a large army is almost counterintuitive. But anyway, number three, when attacking a town that has been already been defended, the attacker must pay attention to any like defending the edges of their own territory from like flanking attacks. This isn't as hard as it really sounds when one considers that no buildings really exist beside the initial ones. So once you identify those, you know, before your attack begins, you know, and then you know, you can pretty much address it pretty quick. If one does not happen to capture like a city, then it becomes fairly easy for them to like keep expanding into new territories, since you receive certain rewards for, you know, successfully defending your properties, essentially. In addition, since players cannot build their own towns but have to rely on their own like limited funds as far as like being able to build armies for defense against other attackers that might come along, their chances of survival decrease in higher difficulty levels, of course, because the amount of enemies grows exponentially larger. And again, especially with AI controlled heroes added into the mix, you know, it pulls the typical RTS. A higher difficulty means the AI can just kind of cheat, but that's not necessarily a bad thing, especially when the AI, and we'll get into it later, but the AI is not the greatest. Like, it was nothing to write home about, if I do recall. I remember the AI making horrible decisions even at higher difficulties. But yeah. Number 4. One unique feature about this game is the spell crystals mechanic, which allowed players to cast spells without any mana, instead requiring the use of the crystals found throughout the maps instead. To compensate for this, certain skills were available only once like a set number of crystals had been collected, so there is a certain threshold to even begin using certain ones, let alone being able to save some up. I don't really know how many crystals you needed to actually gain access to like all of them. I don't even know if that was even possible, really, without like being really good at the game, which of course I wasn't when I was young. But you know, again, you know, I never really bothered like trying to get to the end of that, because it was like insanely difficult, because you're trying to like, they're limited, and you are essentially having to fight the AI players in order to even like accomplish that, right? That being said, moving on to point 5. Players could also upgrade and buy different kinds of equipment, including armors, like helmets, weapons, shields, which provided various bonuses depending on what was equipped. Some items even came with like magical abilities that enhanced your character or like your units in some way, at the cost of like additional spell crystals. So it would take spell crystals basically to like swap out equipments. A popular weapon that I remember distinctly was called the Boomerang Blade. It was a two-handed sword that you could attach to your hero, but it would deal damage, like it would deal the same damage as like a regular warrior unit, but it had the chance to stun enemy units in like a short like AoE like ranged attack directly around your hero. So I always thought that was pretty cool and unique compared to a lot of the others. In addition to normal attacks, there are also some special moves like throwing boulders and you know, swinging a big old shield around to basically interrupt attacks. But other than that, like I cannot remember too many other distinct weapons or like weapon abilities off the top of my head. However, as I said earlier, there wasn't much. There's really not too much point though in investing like too much money and resources into upgrading anything in particular, because I mean, except for maybe some like of the hero upgrades, like there wasn't really too many upgrades that were too meaningful, considering pretty much everybody starts with like the same general like gear and starting army. But you know, by, you know, gathering the resources, I mean, you do benefit from that. Like I said, honestly, a lot of what you'll be dealing with is mostly just hero upgrades, because the heroes are just so powerful, and the abilities that you can give to them slash the equipment that you can give to them is just like kind of actually broken sometimes to like a awesome degree. But anyway, but yeah, so basically it was always good to kind of keep an extra stockpile of the crystals, like I said, kind of keep them like hidden somewhere and keep them safe. Although it doesn't really work too well, because I don't know, I'm pretty sure the AI, they kind of knew anyway, like where they were, because they would sometimes just randomly attack anything without any kind of prompt. And also, if they did, like, it was fairly much like the AI, they were fairly not smart when it came to playing smart, let's just say. But anyway, number 6, as mentioned before, since nobody starts with like any like buildings that they can build, like that you start out with your towns, it makes sense to basically focus on sending out warriors to try to clear out as much land early on as you can. Basically clear out any existing defenses that you can before sending your workers to start making claims. This is done by simply moving each square, like moving, each like grid space, until you kind of reach the next location and effectively like build a path between one village to the next. Which that's done automatically if you have your worker present, going out and doing that. If a village happens to be completely destroyed, though, which I remember there was the possibility for it to be completely destroyed. It was rare, but there was a chance. But yeah, you'll lose point. You'll basically, if you would have gained points from capturing that town, you instead lose those points. Like you just don't get any points at all. But yeah, more or less. Also, if you like are able to take down enemy cities and towns early on, it does like give you a lot of like benefits early on, because each place that you own, you sort of get exponential benefits from. As I guess the implication is you basically have trade in between each of the different basically trade between each of the different like towns, more or less, right? And as a result, you effectively end up with more resources overall that you're able to generate because you have multiple towns, even if you have the same worker capacity. You effectively still gain sort of the additional benefits here. I was gonna say sorry, I got distracted by the battle. You gotta love Age of Empires, man. Age of Empires is just such a solid game. But anyway, back to our topic here. Going to be looking at point 7. I believe that combat takes place automatically every turn, unless a player, what's a good way to word it? Unless a player chooses otherwise, but I really can't say what type of battle like kind of occurs. I remember there's certain like random intervals that combat occurs as like a turn-based thing, but otherwise it's mostly just RTS. But yeah, there was also some sort of like a morale system that was implemented. But since I do remember seeing a unit, I do remember units breaking formation as well after like suffering like heavy casualties, which is what I was saying earlier about like sometimes you don't want a whole lot of people. Sometimes it's best actually to hold off instead. But yeah. Anyway, the AI does appear to pretty much always try to flank the enemy regardless of if it knows whether, there's any kind of opposition or if there's anything in the way. It will just like choose a target and then just try to focus on that target. So sometimes, this will result in their hero just straight out getting killed instead because the enemy was able to just use the AI's own actions sort of as a to be able to just retaliate and in turn. But yeah, I do not recall, I don't really recall there being many defensive structures in the game overall, like towers, catapults, things like that. That being said, moving on to our next point, number 8. There are several different warrior types. From what I recall, it was the sword type, spear, shield, axe, hammer, bow, and spell. So amongst those, there were 4 different basic like skills that you could buy and upgrade via the crystals. But these could also you could also learn like a few spells by sacrificing crystals, which could also be cast using those too. let's see. Oh, yeah, any of the spells, from what I remember, they were pretty, like, fairly balanced, like, pretty equal overall. They all seem to deal, like, a fixed amount of damage, somewhere, like, between, like, 8 and 15, I think. It also depends on what equipment you have. But, pretty much every spell cost, the same amount. It was, like, one, like, crystal point, or, like, crystal shard, or crystal whatever they were called. To increase your chances at casting certain spells, though, you could also sacrifice more in order to like either like level up your hero's abilities, or just to give you like a better chance of success, because I remember spells were able like to fail as well at some points. But let me think, as far as anything else in regards to that. Oh yeah, like I said, the spell crystals, they were like limited, so you did kind of need to be smart about how you utilize that component. Moving on to number 9. The hero class had access to like unique spells and abilities, including those like I remember invincibility, like regeneration, more or less like an increased not really increased, but like decreased like mana cost, which would last, you know, until basically they're either knocked out or just like completely just like removed from play, you know, dead or otherwise. But for example, like and also there's like a time component to it too, because I remember there's certain elements that play out in real time, but some elements that are turn-based. And in those cases, I remember if you, like, for example, if like a hero takes like 2 hits within like 10 seconds, and like basically there's a cooldown timer of like 20 seconds for an ability, it means that like as far as like real time versus the the turn-based, it's basically like, I guess, 2 turns worth of combat in that scenario, comparative to what it would be, I guess, in the real-time equivalent. But yeah, more or less, yeah. But there were also other abilities that come to mind. I can't remember too much else specifically, but I mean, there were others like shield, tornado, ice bolt. I mean, very typical things, but things nonetheless. But yeah, number 10. Every player started out with either 100 free warriors and 1,000 workers, or basically flip that. You either started with 1,000 workers or 1,000 warriors and then 100 workers. Which, you know, over the course of the game, both would be depleted, depending on, you know, more or less what you used, right? And these would, you know, provide more resources needed to, upgrade your different characters and, you know, the units in general. Some like play strategies, at least from what I recall with the AI, it seemed like some focused more on like just solely upgrading like themselves, instead of like wasting that on like getting additional units. But like from what I knew, like building units was actually incredibly important and useful, as you know, it basically, you know, over time you would eventually get to the point where you would just have basically infinite resources, just because of you know, just that's just how it be. But yeah, moving on to number 11. I was gonna say, it looks like we're having another pretty big battle on our way. But yeah, moving on to number 11. There is also a building that was called the Armory, which is where you pretty much did all of your upgrades from. It was like the one important building that you always needed to have. But it allowed you to convert, oh yeah, and that's the other thing. I'm just reading my notes now. Not only like could you upgrade your units here, but you could also convert any of your workers into warriors of the different types. So that being said, one thing that was interesting is that it didn't actually change the stats Nor did it really allow you to like equip different weapons to them. But it did increase the amount of experience that you would gain from killing enemy troops. Since soldiers sort of gained like no experience by like killing off the different heroes and such, in reality, it didn't really play out too much. I mean, it wasn't that important to be getting experience through that kind of means. But that being said, on the flip side though, converting peasants did result in only like half of the points being converted, like the population points or whatever they were called back then. So in other words, like, though they can still be like used in battle but like weren't as effective, since they didn't take as many resources to maintain, they could be massed in much bigger numbers. So effectively, it's like, while, it kind of is more like a late game sort of thing if you have extra people that you want to utilize. They did serve, a little, more of a purpose than just being there. It did give your army sort of a nice like visual of like being bigger, as well as also just having the extra numbers. More or less sort of the meat shield of your army. But anyway, moving on to number 12. When playing as a warrior and defeating an enemy soldier, your hero gains experience. Like somewhere, like I remember, like it doesn't take very much experience to level up. If I remember, it was like between like 1 and 5 experience, I believe, per kill. And it also, I think it also depended on how strong the opponent was, and whether like your attack was dealt, more or less like I guess how the damage was dealt, too. But yeah, if you happen to take out one of the enemy like heroes or like one of the champions, you effectively gain like, I think it was like 20 times that amount. Like it was like an insane amount. I mean, it's basically, in a game like comparable to it, it's basically like taking out an entire civilization. But you get a huge bonus for doing that. And that bonus actually is exponential. It was like the first one that you would take out would give you like 20, then the next would give you like 40, and it would just keep going up, which really incentivized you if you were trying to play like as an aggressive player. You would be incentivized to like keep pressing the attack on more and more nations before the end of the game. But yeah, once you had enough experience, it would automatically level you up and your stats would increase. However, there were also some skills that cost additional points that really aren't given to you when you level up. Like I said, sometimes you'll need those crystal shards, like I said before. But yeah, if one wishes to actually learn certain skills at higher levels, then you need to also spend your resources wisely to actually acquire those. Yeah, I don't really recall having seen any like stat bonuses other than mostly like HP increases, like by just like leveling up. It seems like a lot of your other stats are pretty much determined, I wouldn't say solely on equipment, but it seemed like HP was really the only thing that consistently leveled up that I could really remember. But yeah, moving on to number 13. So workers can be trained to work in fields that then produce food, which is, one of the resource types needed to sustain the population and also raise troops, and also necessary for buildings. Like, more or less, like the food quotes was more just like resource, and any resource that you acquired kind of went to like a bulk like storage basically, and it was utilized pretty much across the board for different things. That being said, it's probably wise not to rely too heavily on like a mass storage, because the thing is, if any of your storages get destroyed, then it's all gone. But you do want to make sure that you have enough to sort of last into the end game. But yeah, I guess it depends on more or less how you more or less are trying to play. Whether you want to train up additional workers to be able to produce more resources, or if you think trying to press the assault and just focus on primarily attack would be more beneficial for you. Moving on to 14. Moving on to 14. So some people claim that from what I remember, or at least like because I remember like seeing other people talk about this game back in the day, and it's like people, like, the one criticism about the game that I remember was that it wasn't really fair, that you could basically pull your people out of your place and then the other person gets like no bonus, because like at that point, you know, they could always just like go to like basically like a new home before like combat even begins, whereas like the warriors kind of, they had to, like, you know, it's like your enemy warriors, like they basically would be forced to like stay behind, or like, you know, stay into the like attack mode basically, and they couldn't really undeploy at that point until the actual place has been captured. So you effectively kind of gridlock your army until you actually are able to like conquer the place fully, right? But yeah, I mean, to me, I don't know, it didn't really bother me, I guess. Then again, I mostly just played with AI players, right? So I guess it didn't really matter too much, you know, exactly how it played out. But yeah, on top of that, yeah, you know, simply staying inside your walls though, and sort of refusing to like sort of move and actually gather anything, so there's like different states for your armies. There's like a reserve, which is like whenever your armies are in your own town, and then there's like a readied mode, and like if they're within like a walled city, like they're not considered ready, so they don't even get to fight. It's really weird. So effectively, you almost have to move your people outside of your town before they can even help with the defense of the town. You know, you can't just have them kind of parked in your town and expect them to actually fight, because they're not considered ready, because they're like standby or whatever they called it. But yeah, that being said, and I guess one benefit though, the one reason that you would want to keep them in there effectively is because they don't have a like an upkeep if they're stationed, versus if, you know, you just kind of have them just free reign whatever, you know, across the map. But that being said, moving on to number 15. There is a theft mechanic in the game, so you can have like your resources stolen, like I kind of mentioned earlier, as well. If someone does steal your stuff though, there's not really too much of a point in chasing them down, because usually by the time you actually reclaim your resources, like you've already spent more in order to try to like catch the party responsible and try to like reclaim those resources. So honestly, the best thing to do is just like sit back and just kind of wait for, you know, stuff to reappear, either like, you know, finding it and claiming it on the map, or there was also a market system, and you would effectively, you know, you could also, you know, find resources there, and certain equipments too, actually. But yeah, just kind of keeping in mind that the thieves will, you know, they'll show up and try to steal, you know, from enemies too. You know, it's like you're not the only one getting your resources stolen, so it's kind of like a, you know, everybody's taking a hit here and there, but really it's not worth actually trying to do much about it. Like, it was very much an unutilized component to the game, in my opinion. It didn't really matter if stuff got stolen. But yeah, pretty much, you know, it's like you lose some resources, but they're so easily acquired, at least in the earlier game, that it doesn't really, there's not much consequence to it. As far as I recall, as well, nobody really ever came who like tried taking like anything super valuable. Again, mostly just the resources, because like you could technically steal the equipments too, but those were usually connected to a hero unit, so it didn't really matter, because it's not like they're going to steal them off the hero units without, you know, killing off the hero units, which was very difficult. I'm just going to say the hero units were a little overpowered, all things considered. That being said, moving on to good old number 16. Yeah, moving on to number 16. Although not every single building, let me reread. Sorry, I'm reading my notes here. Although not every single building can be constructed, like not every building can be constructed at like every part of the game. Like sometimes you will lack the materials to build it, and also certain level requirements for certain buildings as well. So you kind of had to, like, instead of like Age of Empires, for example, where you kind of age up and then get new buildings, in this it's like level driven. It's very much more of like an RPG component associated with it. But that being said, there's also like a certain time limit to being able to build certain things, and you can only build certain buildings within like certain seasons within the game, because there was like actually kind of like a time cycle, like a very rudimentary one from what I remember. It's basically like, oh, okay, well, 10 days or whatever, and then it's a different season or whatever. But these different seasons did impact what options you had available as far as being able to build. And again, like, like for example, and this is one that I remember, like for example, once like winter ends and spring comes around, then you can go ahead and start building up farmlands. But the thing is, you can't really do that into like the fall and winter seasons. So you were kind of like, you could gain certain benefits from certain buildings like periodically throughout like the game. You couldn't like utilize those throughout like the entire game. So there was a bit of micromanaging here and there, honestly, to try to deal with that. Not that I'm opposed to it. Micromanaging's fun here and there. But yeah, this also, like I said, it applies to buildings and structures, that were also like standing in the previous cycle. So the thing is, if you did build that farm to replace like a building in spring, just be mindful that that is going to be an invalid building once fall comes around. So making sure that you have enough stuff set aside to be able to convert that into something a bit more useful. Okay, that being said, number 17. Each faction starts off as neutral in order to encourage like overall peaceful relationships at the early game between the nations. And considering that neither side really benefits from waging war right off the bat, it's usually a good time just to collect resources amongst yourselves instead of focusing on warfare right from the get-go, because that's a very costly endeavor. But yeah, it's usually not, it wasn't really that wise to really join forces with too many main factions, though, because then you might end up kind of getting cornered later down the road and in a really tight spot. But yeah, that being said, there wasn't really, if things did come to worse and you were to lose, there wasn't really a penalty for that. Should something go awry and an ally immediately turns into an enemy, because unexpected turn of events of RTS games. But yeah, there wasn't really any penalty for just like starting a new game. And if anything, sometimes just having a save and then reloading it, like the AI just makes different decisions. I don't know if that was intended or if it's just like the randomness that early AI in these types of games had, but very much a thing of, yeah, like I said, very much like if you saved it and loaded it, it was very much a different result, I suppose, of the dice roll at the end of the day, when it came to that. So, but yeah, that being said, yeah, since it was unlikely that anybody really wanted to fight, for the most part, like I remember, like really the only time that you had to worry about enemies, at least the AI, like is pretty much if you were particularly weak or if you were the one to press the attack. But yeah, it was unlikely, but again, it might just be better overall to still like keep distance away from the people that might tend to be a little bit more hostile, because and it's pretty easy to tell early on if the AI happens to be building up a pretty sizable force. Then it's a pretty good tell that, okay, well, maybe, just maybe, something's going on here. But yeah. Anyway, moving on to our next point. Moving on to number 18. Each village has its own like production menu where workers could be assigned to produce different goods depending on what type of unit is selected. So for example, like if you wanted to build like an army of spearmen, then like your workers, your peasants would like finish up with whatever they're doing. So say they're like currently producing shields and swords, you can't take them away from that until they're done. But once they're done with that, basically once all of those workers have been used up, then you can assign them to creating some like spears or like some axes, something different, so as far as like I'm aware, there weren't really any penalties in terms of like experience or any of like your resources for like upgrading any faster than anybody else. I know that there were like different bonuses that you would get for certain actions, but I don't think like the speed at which you progressed really mattered outside of like just the typical like, oh, okay, well now I can just have better units and stuff like that, right? And I think like as far as that's pretty much all that I had on that topic, really. Moving on to number 19. Again, it's sort of a thing of what do you call them? Sort of going back to sort of the idea of like stealing. So like, why would you want to if it doesn't really matter? Like if you try to get the stuff back. I mean, there was like an economy in the game. So, I mean, it was possible to like steal like gold or like resources from, opponents. But, again, didn't really matter too much from what I remember. You usually got enough throughout the course of the game to where it, wasn't necessarily required. That being said, gold coins I do remember because there was like actual gold coins or like gold bars or something, but they came in like two different sets. Like you basically had like normal gold bars, but then you had like gold, like I don't know, like you had like gold bars, and then you had like I don't know, like a gold stack or something, and it was like it was basically like 10 times a normal thing, but it took up less like storage space, I think. So you would like basically stack it in order to like conserve space. Again, I don't remember it ever being an issue because you could just usually you had enough to be able to make do. But both of those again they exist separately as far as like how they're categorized, and they also are worth different amounts in the market. But yeah, more or less ultimately I guess the importance of the gold though, as opposed to the other like just flat resource, is that that is what determined the market values. So the more gold that was readily available within the market, the better the prices would be on everything. So you were incentivized to try to accumulate as much gold as you could. Not that you necessarily needed it, but it ultimately made for cheaper transactions in your own markets. But again, more or less the worst part about losing those like the gold is that there's not really a way of getting it back too easily. And also knowing that like, the fact that you had that stolen means that now the enemy is going to have a benefit from it. It's going to help them raise their overall production and make their costs cheaper by by several orders of magnitude, really, by just providing them with a lot of extra stuff to be able to buy units with. And again, I don't know if it really mattered, considering I'm pretty sure the AI would cheat anyway, depending on the AI difficulty. But that's a whole nother topic. Anyway, moving on to our next topic. So number 20. All players start out on their own like continent, is for lack of a better way to put it. It's like island, continent, something like that. But in effect, you basically you basically have, like I said, that continent or island, and it was separated into like 3 different zones. Not that it really mattered, and not that you could really like tell though. You basically had like a desert, or I'm pretty sure it's like a desert, and maybe it was like a grassland, a forest, and like a frozen part. It was kind of like it kind of built like almost like northern, right? So like you basically had like a forest in the middle, then like an icy mountain in the most northern region. Then to the south you basically had like I said, sort of like that grassland or like desert or something. It's hard to tell sometimes with old style graphics, but you know, we make the most of it. But yeah, so these were basically mostly uninhabited at the start, and then like I said, you would claim the different places. But yeah, mostly like I feel like a lot of, I guess, the display of it is really just for like flavor, because really the terrain itself, there wasn't really much standing out, so you kind of, it was a little plain, for lack of a better way to put it. It came across as rather plain, and it didn't really matter that like there were like different zones, and it had different like production bonuses. You basically just had to remember, basically just remember, versus like actually having like a sure tell of, you know, this, that, or the other. But yeah, overall, I mean, as far as like building a base in that said continent, like more or less you basically just build it along the border, because that's usually enough to just stop anything moving inward. Like there wasn't much incentive to really build any kind of like an operating base anywhere but the front line, so a lot of your back stuff was basically just production and storage. But yeah, as far as like I recall, there wasn't really any reward for killing enemy units that came into your own land though, which, you know, it's like either way. I mean, I suppose in that regard, I guess the game did incentivize you to play more aggressively, but I feel like it was almost counterintuitive, because the game did push a lot of like diplomatic options too. So it was a weird combo. Like there were benefits for playing aggressive, but there were elements to encourage diplomacy instead, and it's like, I don't know. That's the thing, it's such a weird game. Like that's why I want to play it again, because like maybe I'm just remembering stuff wrong. You know what I mean? It's like, I don't know, man. But yeah, you know, unfortunately the thing is, like, you know, unless you have people both able to attack and defend readily, you might be too busy trying to like expand and not even realize until like it's too late that like the enemy's already upon you. You know what I mean? More or less the idea of like, you know, unless you have scouts to actively be doing stuff, then you're probably gonna get caught off guard, and then if you get caught off guard, you're basically done. You're basically done. But anyway, moving on. As far as the actual combat zones, it seemed like there were only, and this would be point 21. So there, from what I recall, there were like only like 2 areas to like really battle on. These were like basically like a plains, like flatland style thing, and then there were like some that were like hills. The former, again, you know, a flatland, plains. They provided a better like side advantage overall, but they were more difficult to like kind of like defend around and actually like strategize with, for lack of a better way to put it, just simply because everything kind of was visible right from the get-go. Whereas with the latter, you know, the hillsides, you'll find that you have, you know, those higher ground sort of bits that do block line of sight, but they do kind of give advantages here and there depending on what weapons you're using. So, you know, whether you're using your ranged weapons, your magics, things like that. But yeah, so again, each faction does start out with like 4 Well, it can. I remember, like, I always had like pretty much everything like set to the max. So you would by default start with like 4 village, or 4 like plain battle zones located near like the different ends of your continent, which I felt like was pretty balanced, because then you wouldn't have to worry about just like everybody just getting right into your stuff, you know, without really being able to intervene too much. But yeah, yeah, eventually, you know, more or less, they aren't all that important at first, but they'll certainly come in handy like later into the game, because you effectively, you know, I mean, eventually you're going to be almost 100% focused on combat, so that will be very important, because that's basically your combat zones, or at least your safe combat zones, to be fair. Okay, that being said, number 22, I remember, and it's like, you might be thinking, I thought that this game was good back in the day. It's like, I maybe did, question mark? Maybe not, because I don't remember half anything about it. But I remember the biggest complaint about the game that I had is that there was just like such a lack of variety. Like with the terrain, with the like the units and everything, that it was hard to tell what is what, and it's hard to tell like if you're in an ideal spot or not as far as like terrain is concerned, because it looked similar. And again, the different biomes, like the desert, forest, stuff like that, it didn't really matter, because it was so hard to tell like which was which anyway, that it's like, well, okay, I guess I'm in this one, I don't know. But yeah, although there were a few differences, like, you know, that did exist, kind of like you wouldn't ever see any kind of like water like in the ice area, but like, you know, it's like, other than that, it's just the rest of it just kind of felt like it's just very basic, and just, I don't know, I hate to use a bit of a more modern term, because it's just like like, I don't know, I don't think people were really thinking of like inspired as a word when it came to gaming back in the day. But yeah, it seems like it just was not really inspired. It didn't really have much, I guess, unique going for it. It was very much just like, I guess, cookie cutter RTS, which is odd, because the thing is, and maybe that's the more interesting thing to take away from it, it's like, it's an RTS that was like before a lot of what we consider RTS now. So it's like, maybe they just didn't know how, or like necessarily like good practice for RTS, you know. And it's like, okay, well, I don't know, maybe in a lot of ways, you know, that kind of formula wouldn't really come about too readily until you have games like, well, Age of Empires, you know. It's like Age of Empires really was like one of the early really good you know, one of the early really good RTS games, you know. So maybe the game that I'm thinking about, just it didn't have any kind of like a best practices guide yet. So it just kind of was very avant-garde's not the word, but you know what I'm trying to say. But anyway, but yeah, that's my biggest thing. Also, there were, from what I remember, there were like, I guess like dungeons, quote, but I don't think they were dungeons. I think that they were I think they were supposed to be like castles. Like you would basically have to fight through a castle. But I remember it looked like the visual of it looked very much like a dungeon. So that's what I'm calling them here. But I'm pretty sure it was like supposed to be like the interior of a castle, but it was like very not visually that. But yeah, pretty much all of them look identical. They had different names, but that's pretty much the extent of it. And it didn't really matter too much, because it would pretty much just autoplay. And I don't know, really it was only cool because like you would see like the little icons just kind of like clash, and you know, it's like, okay, cool. It doesn't sound impressive now, but hey, you know, back in you know, before I discovered actually good games, you know, it's like, hey, you know, it was fun for what it was. You know, just having random armies just kind of throw themselves at each other for no reason. but yeah, yeah, let me think. The next point I was going to talk about. Yeah, let me think. Oh, number 23. Although you may want to try building your army up, like, what's a good way to put it? From what I recall, you didn't want to build your army up such that, like, it was almost better to, like, have all your buildings up towards the front line, like, as far as, like, in your continent, but to have your army production, like, almost in the back lines where it wouldn't be discovered readily. Because the thing is, I remember they would, like, the AI at least, they would purposely attack your like unit construction places and basically interrupt it, which was very not great, to be honest with you. But yeah, yeah. Sorry. Just there's so much that I wanted to cover for this game. I mean, I just realized I am already basically an hour into it. So hey, you know, if you've stuck along this long with with today's random mystery game of the hour here, hey, good on you. Thanks for sticking around. But anywho, continuing on with point number 23 here. But yeah, so really the best strategy from what I recall is basically build your troops in secret and then just send all of them last minute to attack, instead of like trying to have like mini duels and stuff amongst your troops. Like, you really wanted to just try to like knock it out as soon as possible, because otherwise you would effectively just be in a real bad spot. That's what I remember as far as the strategy goes. Honestly, I mean, as far as the main points I wanted to cover, that more or less explains the primary like gameplay involved, the gameplay elements, you know, to summarize those points. But again, like, to, I guess, summarize it, the game itself tends to basically, it's an RTS game that places favor into like trying to be diplomatic, while you know, basically just like doing away with like the whole idea of like town building and like those building mechanics that a lot of RTS games kind of favor. Again, you know, Age of Empires, for example, which, you know, currently playing in the background. But yeah, instead of those building components, it does include sort of that unique element, like with the hero units, and does throw in those like RPG elements, which I think are pretty dang cool if you ask me. You know, I feel like if the game had came out later than it did, like if it had a little bit more time to, I guess, be exposed to, I guess, good video game practice, then maybe it would have been better received and maybe not be lost media like I believe it to be now. Because I do not know a single person that knows of this, and I mean, I don't even know of this, so it's like, well, you know, and it's maybe just me being forgetful, which I totally am. And if you want to help me try to remember, hey, I'm here for it. That's exactly why I'm making this video and going this, I suppose, this long-winded about trying to explain it, because like I want to try to give everybody the best info that I can really come up with off the top of my head, to hopefully be able to find this thing sooner than later. But yeah, speaking of the heroes, you know, now that we're kind of in like the what I've discovered so far phase, let's talk about them a little bit more, because those are like the elements that I remember more so in detail compared to the rest. So like, I'd already brought up Krogan earlier, but there's also a couple others that I'll try to iterate here, and you know, maybe try to like generate some visuals for, that we can use to maybe try to like place some of these figures, you know. You know, that might help us to help like define sort of where to place this lost game, yeah, amongst the wave of other RTS games, you know, because ultimately, oh, it looks like our match is over. But that being said, what do you call them? But yeah, in, you know, what I've described thus far has been fairly, I suppose, basic as far as RTS is concerned. I mean, there's a couple of unique elements, and elements that are a bit stranger, perhaps. But yeah, yeah, it's a thing. But yeah, I'm hoping that maybe we could try to figure this out, with what I'm about to go through now, as far as like the different heroes, because I think those are like the one unique thing that I can remember some of that will help guide us towards like identifying like what that that is, you know what I mean? But yeah, again, like I said, Krogan, he was certainly one of my favorites, one of my favorite starting heroes, and probably one of the reasons why, like in retrospect, I kind of feel like Krogan was a bit, it's like, I will say the game itself felt balanced, but certain heroes, if played certain ways, were very unbalanced. And I remember that his thing, like, it was just kind of broken in terms of like the benefit to like the overall army dynamic, which I feel the AI kind of slacked in. Overall, the AI didn't really handle like large armies well. But yeah, so Krogan in particular, he was one of the few heroes that really had a good like army buff to it. Whereas some of the others could like heal and stuff. It didn't really matter, because the thing is, Krogan, and his ability to increase the overall damage output of most of your units, because a lot of your units were, you know, melee combatants. So yeah, more or less, like, you combine that with the fact if you just spam a bunch of like lower level weaker units, they would effectively become, like, just by default, because Krogan's there, they would basically be several tiers higher than what they really should be, just by default, assuming that Krogan is readied up. Which more or less means that he just needs to be in some random field somewhere. He doesn't even need to be in the battle. He could just be in a random field, and it would still allow you to field your army, and they would all benefit the bonuses from it. Another hero though that I do remember playing a lot as, and I'm trying to think. For some reason, the name Metimus, Metimus, like Metimus. Yeah, Metimus. But I looked it up, but I can't find anything. So it's got to be something similar. Yeah, I think that was his name. It was something similar. Looking it up, I can't find anything on it though, so it's probably not right. But it's at least something. I remember it starts with an M though. It starts with an M and ends with a US. Like, but yeah, he was a spell-focused, like, elven-looking hero. But yeah, and the only units that he could actually create from the start were spellcasters. But the thing is, these were only really necessary when you felt like you didn't really have enough time to actually cast any of his spells. Or if you were like trying to like switch between like your different ones at the time, which would require you to go to like one of your settlements to be able to do so. You know, whether that be like, again, like, you know, trying to switch out for like a heal or like a debuff or something, or you know, any other kind of type of spell. But yeah, there were definitely a lot of reasons to play him, like, in my opinion, just because of like how versatile he was. He basically had access to like the full spell tree. So like once you actually did get like a solid grasp of like the gameplay mechanics and kind of like knew how to utilize the heroes better, like playing him and just, I guess, the game in general, didn't really it doesn't really like penalize you, you know, like once you know how to play it well, especially with this particular hero in mind. But again, like, you know, and as far as strategy is concerned, like some games, like I'd personally prefer to like use primarily worker units, and especially with Metimus, because he, like, you know, it's like you could build a lot of worker units and then just see how far you could go like playing the game by only using his spells and just like not having hardly any units at all. Because the thing is, once he reaches a certain level, the costs of his spells do decrease, and the amount of spells that he gets access to, of course, increase over, you know, his levels. And assuming that you have a bunch of workers that could generate the spell crystals, you could basically end up with nearly infinite spell casting, which, you know, maybe just a little bit broken, maybe just a little bit. That being said, there was also one more hero that I could remember off the top of my head, because they were like unique compared to all the others, like visually unique. And if I remember, and again, it's probably not right because I looked it up and I cannot find anything about it. But for some reason I remember it was a hero, female looking, like bear wolf looking creature. But for some reason the name like Bubera seems to come to mind. But I remember it was like specifically like it started with a B. I don't know about the rest, but yeah, Bubera seems to be something that comes to mind. But they were basically like a tankier version of what Krogan was, but like without that like extra damage potential, and provided basically just more survivability and like faster movement basically. Again, like as far as appearance goes, like I say that they were kind of like bear or like wolf looking, but you know, maybe it's like if they weren't human, then maybe they are human, but they just have like some kind of like a pelt hood or like helmet, you know, that would make them look more like a bear or a wolf, right? But yeah, in either case, yeah, here's, roughly what I could, generate from sort of, what stands out to me as far as that, it's like, this heroine in particular, seems like a decent fit, for like, I don't know, from what I remember, like definitely like an earlier game army comp, because that character could kind of like tank and keep everybody else alive. Certainly better than what Krogan can. Krogan, while that damage boost is good, it ultimately results in having a lot of your people just die out. Because like, well, it's like when you have, Krogan just, DPS phase everybody, compared to Bubera, who is basically able to just like solo tank like just a whole army and just like stand there for a while. Like, it saves you a lot of resources, but it's a very defensive game style overall, I would say. But yeah, more or less, that character, like you could have a like a much slower paced sort of game. Like you didn't really need to be fast about like trying to like mobilize your armies and stuff. You can kind of just take your time, because you kind of did just have, you just had time, to work with. But really the problem is that you do really need like a few specific troop types though, with Bubera's passive ability to actually make it like a valid, because the thing is, like, any of like the initial resources that you get would deplete really quick, trying to build up certain units. And unfortunately, with that slower style gameplay, more defensive style gameplay, you're gonna have to be a lot smarter about how you play in order to basically accomplish victory, in the long run, right? That being said, battles themselves aren't exactly complicated, at least in theory. Here's the thing. I don't know why they did it, but for some reason at the start of the game, you can only fight like one unit at a time, unless like you both have bigger armies, which can be kind of dull, honestly. Like it was pretty dull from like what I remember early on, because the thing is, if they just have like a single hero and you send an entire army, you basically have an army that's fighting one guy one at a time. So there's really no incentive to really send like large groups of units, since it's like you send a army of weak people, they're attacking 1v1. Of course their hero is just kind of overpowered. They're likely to die out pretty quick if they're attacked by a strong opponent. So it's just like, and again, it's like, I guess the way to counter that would be to you know, if you can manage to land like a couple of armies up on one target and kind of do attacks like right in a row, but you know, the likelihood of that happening is not very likely, simply because, you know, by the time you have multiple armies, your opponents also are likely to have multiple armies. But yeah, after the game progresses and, you know, combat does tend to get better as the game progresses. You know, as like, you know, you start to make efficient armies and the enemies make efficient armies. But yeah, you know, it's like, until then though, until like the mid to late game, like you'll definitely find that the early game is a bit of a grind, just because like you are kind of just limited to the number of units that you can deploy at a time. And again, it's like, okay, well, I don't want to duel with the random strong guy. You know, I want to send my whole army and just crush him, but I can't. Which was, I don't understand it, but hey, you know. But anyway, I mean, to be honest though, the enemy AI is like really not that smart. So, you know, again, like they tended to, like I said, I mean, send out just a random strong guy. You know, the thing is, as long as you had basically two armies, you could fight him pretty well. Like even though the heroes are really strong, like they could pretty much only take out one army by themselves, and that's the extent of it, until like they actually level up and become really strong. You know what I mean? But yeah. I know that we've talked about a lot. We're kind of wrapping up here soon. Just a couple little final points before we finish up. But yeah, to more or less sum up what we've talked about so far, you know, since we, you know, went through the gameplay and, you know, what we're talking about now, to kind of sum up what I've talked about in the past couple points, heroes are relatively balanced, although there are a few exceptions that come to mind, which I've already brought up, like Krogan and even Metamus. Even he's a little broken depending on how you play him. Starting locations are overall well designed. I like the idea of having like different battle zones, and again having like all of the sliders for like size, like overall like starting like size and everything, having all those stuff turned up certainly made it better. You know, they have their good advantages and disadvantages, but the thing is, like, all of the different areas of the game are so visually similar that you can't really even tell like which area is which at first glance. Like there's really nothing too distinguishing about each zone unless you specifically kind of look at the in-game map to identify. It's like, okay, well, I'm here now. So that was one thing that was a little annoying. Also, battles aren't really too difficult in terms of well, difficulty. Overall, I mean, it's a fairly easy game even at higher difficulties. But yeah, I would say though, like it's not exactly, it's fun at first, but I remember like definitely growing bored of it, especially when you compare it to something like any of your like more modern RTS games, which do prefer sort of like higher pay, like higher octane games, you know, faster paced action throughout most of like the entire like gaming session, you know. Also, yeah, hero characters do add a lot of variety to the gameplay, which I really did like, because their abilities would encourage them to play in, like, you could play in a lot of different ways, like from game to game, and you know, and that's different because the thing is, like, even with watching Age of Empires here in the background, you could tell like blue team, which is what we're following throughout this, you could tell that they basically just spam basically cavalry. So basically, as you could tell, they were just spamming like the cavaliers, they were spamming the like the horse archers, like camel archers, and you know, it's like at least this game, like the game that I'm talking about, the Lost game, at least it seems like all of the units have like valid uses throughout the course of a game, and that like none of them are too particularly better than the others, let's say. That being said, one final note though, as far as like the game itself that might help describe it, Yeah, I wouldn't say describe it, but more or less another criticism. No, not really a criticism either, though. But yeah, but more or less, let's just talk about the world itself here for a little bit. Again, there wasn't really much to it, besides some minimal, like, lore drops given about, like, the hero characters. There really wasn't much explanation as to, like, the wins and whys of, like, the conflicts, and even, like, the idea of, like, the building sites. Like, you know, they didn't really explain why there was limitations to, like, being able to build, you know? Like, there wasn't really any explanation for, I guess, why the game. You know what I mean? Like, there just wasn't much explanation. It's like, okay, it's just a real-time strategy game and that's it. Let's see. But yeah, I mean, there's not really any explanation for, like, why the conflicts, like, why the locations are how they are. Yeah, I mean, there's really just not much to explain it. More or less, you're basically just going to different places and gathering resources, and that's it. I mean, that's the extent of the gameplay. One thing worth mentioning, though, is that there was a day-night cycle, which I thought was pretty neat. Which did add an extra element of, like, exploration and, like, difficulty for, like, trying to gather up stuff. Because some area of the games would actually, over time, become uninhabitable. Because the thing, yeah, unless they were protected, of course, but because the thing is, at night, enemies would spawn, just like random, just natural enemies would spawn. This actually does, from what I recall, it didn't really happen too frequent, or like, it wasn't that big of a problem to deal with, but, it's just being aware that, like, and here's the thing that I didn't like about it. Let's just keep on that point. The thing that I didn't like about that, though, is because there wasn't really any indicator of what time of day it was, other than basically seeing the enemies spawn. Like, there wasn't, like, yeah, at least, like, yeah, they didn't really explain that. Like, if nothing else, at least the developers gave, like, thought into that mechanic, which is pretty cool. But yeah, again, like, it does put, like, an unnecessary hamper on stuff, and it's really hard to tell, like, until, like, it's too late and you already are getting attacked, that, like, you're even sort of at threat at the moment. But yeah, I guess the fun part there, though, is it's like, yeah, again, I don't know, like, I get what they were going for, but some indication so that you wouldn't just be just kind of winging it would be nice, especially since you are already having to micromanage so much other stuff. It makes it unnecessarily tricky in my book. But yeah, on that note, though, I did just have, like, a random thought. If I do recall, the axe units, like the axe warriors, they were, like, the one unit that I did tend to use a lot. And I think maybe that's just because, like, they had, like, I think, like, by default, they had the highest attack value compared to the others. And as a result, I think they just scaled better overall with Krogan's passive ability. But yeah, perhaps not, because, like, you know, it's like, I don't know. Like, yeah, I don't remember. I just remember the action units were cool, so I use those a lot. But that being said, also, oh yeah, Bubera's, or whatever their name is, Bubera's passive ability, it was just called Protect, and it worked similarly to, like, I don't know, what's a good way to put it? So if you were basically, the way I picture it, it's like if you were basically playing a World of Warcraft, like what's the wolf folk looking people? If you're basically playing one of those but as a paladin or something, is like what it kind of like gives me the vibe of. But that being said, next up, I just want to talk about combat a little bit, because we touched on it earlier, but, like, nah, there's not much more that I need to add for combat. We already covered that pretty well. But yeah, one thing that should be noted though, I guess in that regard, is that there wasn't really a way to really create like a defensive formation, like at all. So basically, you know, unlike certain other games where you could like set formations, this game you basically had to manually just keep everybody in line, instead of like chasing after like people. You know, if you were trying to play defensive, like you had to manually try to control your people to do so. Really, one of the only tactics that I remember is basically just like leaving a few people behind, like behind your line specifically, that you could then use in a pinch. As the thing is, you might just have one random enemy walk by, and then like your whole army just chases that one guy, and then now you're left defenseless. And that would be very bad, very, very bad. But yeah, after playing through the first like few maps though, or like the first few games, like you do start realizing that, like, again, like honestly, I feel like it was very well executed the way that they did it. They really do incentivize you into having those different army comps, unlike certain other games. Like, and you do really need to like focus in on that to make sure that your heroes are being best utilized, you know. So while like a ranged unit or like a melee tank can easily fill certain roles, having multiple tanks may lead to like a weaker overall like defense, you know, in like the long run, because they're not quite as fast paced as like cavalry attacks, which could break the line of your troops. You know what I mean? But yeah, it's usually smarter to stick with what, like, I don't know. I guess it's better to stick with like an overall well-rounded assembly of people, unless it's like absolutely necessary for like one of the particular hero bonuses. Like if you have some troops that would just benefit more from that, it's like you should probably focus in on that. But yeah, you also might find yourself wanting to hold back on using the spells as well, just because the resources are limited. Your spellcasting is limited. But again, like, you know, for example, like with the Bubera's special, or like one of their skills, right? It would be sometimes less efficient to actually utilize the protectability versus being able to just have more troops to replace it, right? So it's certainly a balance, you know, in terms of managing those resources. But yeah, speaking of units still, I did enjoy being able to like one thing that I really liked about the game, and I wish that other games would do, is allowing you to switch out your units from one to another. So, and what I mean like by that is like you basically have like one unit type and you could switch it to another unit type if you go to the armory. That was like a really interesting mechanic to me, because it allowed you to switch up your army kind of like last minute, especially considering the AI had a tendency of choosing specifically what would counter your army. And there were certain counters throughout the game, and I can't remember them off the top of my head. I remember it's like sword beats spear, axe loses to spear. It's a whole thing. But being able to switch was actually really cool. As far as like being able to switch up your army composition like really quick and like readily. Like for example, one unit that worked out really well in the early game, they were called garbage. What are they called? I'm trying to remember off the top of my head. I actually didn't write this down. I'm pretty sure they were called like Vanguardians. I think they were called Vanguardians. But they basically served as something as like scouts at the beginning of the like at the beginning stages of the game. But they were good for like switching out later down the road to like a heavier cavalry, like down the road. you know, because it's like, okay, well, you know, once you actually know where the enemy's at, having scouts is slightly less necessary. You know what I mean? But yeah, once you get, once, you know, you kind of figure things out, you know, they kind of do lose value, because the thing is, they aren't exactly the greatest, and they don't really have very good armor or anything. So it really only makes them good for like the early game. Oh, and again, it's been a little bit, so to do one more sort of summary bit here as we kind of wrap up. Let's see. The world itself is like visually, you know, and I was hating on the visuals earlier. Like the game is like it was visually appealing. It wasn't very interesting, and it was difficult to like navigate, which was a little annoying. Especially considering the lack of like visual differences between like the different regions, and each region having like different like benefits. You know, being able to identify that quickly, kind of a big point, at least in my book. Gameplay overall was pretty simple, and like it, you know, it did make it more difficult by having like such small troop numbers in your armies, especially initially. Or not so much having small numbers, but having smaller like effective numbers. The early game especially, like having a large army wasn't really that good. Having better troops was better in the early game, but you know, it's very much harder to come by the resources early in, so it's like, I don't know, it's kind of backwards. You know, it's like into the late game, you almost want nothing but like super weak troops that you could just spam. But in the early game, where you would think those units would be more accessible, like they're really just not that great. Some strategy also involved in the combat, or some strategy is also involved in combat, such as having multiple tanks present in your army, for example. But yeah, again, doesn't really change how the game feels too much, since most of the battles only last around like 5 minutes at the most. Like a lot of the battles were fairly short overall, and yeah, as a result, you know, it didn't really, you know, as long as you had troops to throw at it, you pretty much were guaranteed to like not really win or lose, you know, so long as like you kept just like playing the game basically. It was hard to lose, maybe is a good way to put it. You'll need to experiment with many different types of armies before you can really start figuring out what works. I remember, like, yeah, that was a big point for me with the game, is that you know, it's like each of the heroes has its benefits and its like negatives, and just making sure that you kind of you have an army composition and overall strategy that best puts your hero to use, because your hero really is like the best thing that you have to utilize. And you know, like I said, you know, even early on they can basically take stuff out unto themselves, but especially later on they can basically take on like entire armies just unto their own, because like, yeah, they were pretty dang good. That's all I'm gonna say. And one final note in that regard, while I did like being able to like switch between the different units, it did come at a cost. It wasn't like free, so but it was certainly like a fraction of the cost. You know what I mean? So while it could be said that like it's bad because you're wasting resources on trying to switch your army composition, like, you know, while you already have a standing army, it does, I guess you can balance it out by just playing smarter overall. But it is a nice fallback, because a lot of the times in, you know, RTS games, it's pretty much like do or die. Like you either did something correctly and you're going to benefit from it, or you're kind of out of luck. So, you know, yeah, you hate to see that. But anyway, and I guess to kind of wrap things up, I know we've been going for a while now, and thanks again for sitting through all this. Anyone that actually has, because like, hey, I certainly want your opinion on it. But yeah, to kind of wrap up, so you might be thinking like, you know, I have no idea what this guy is talking about, but like, you know, the thing that I hope instead that you think is that like, okay, it's like, oh well, no, I know exactly what that guy is talking about. Because like, honestly, the thing is like, I you know, to me, this game is lost media. It's something that I cannot find anything about, and I really want to know what everybody else knows about this, or what anybody else like thinks about this, or if anybody else has even played this. You know, I'm sure that somebody has, and I hope that I hope that somebody else actually knows and can speak on this, because yeah, I mean, here's the thing, like, so like, imagine like, you know, that you played this game like back in like early 2000s, for example. It's like, I mean, you know, it's like basically like being, you know, 7 to 10 years old. You know, it's like, it's, you know, overall, I mean, a game like this was still like very much in like the early stages of like where RTS games were. And I mean, you know, it's like I might have played it in 2000, but I mean, like, this game had to be like early 90s if I had to guess, right? So like, you know, it's like, again, you know, that game was like very much in like the early stages of RTS games. And, you know, like initially like games like that were kind of struggling to find a place, like as far as like a player base, because oftentimes like, you know, coming across these titles, you know, it's like other potential genres kind of like took hold. You know, it's like you had your like your Zeldas, like your RPGs, you had your Marios, like your side scrollers. You know, it's like a lot of your early RTS examples really fell flat compared to sort of the faster paced situations that these other games could push, just because of like the different medium of it, right? But anywho, but yeah, again, like, definitely a different breed of game, that's for sure. And it's certainly a different breed of game even as far as RTS is concerned now. But yeah, thankfully we do get to see, like, you know, some of these titles reach, you know, mainstream appeal. You know what I mean? It's like, you know, again, you do have like games like Age of Empires. You know, it's like the RTS as a genre did succeed, but yeah, the early stages of RTS, like, very much underappreciated is maybe a good way to put it. Yeah, sort of underappreciated that. But yeah, you know, while some RTS games of that time period did find success, unfortunately, some, you know, ended up never really finding that success, never really got any sequels, nor really received much attention, you know? And, you know, like the game, you know, the mystery game that, you know, I've been talking about for a good hour and a half now, you know, it's like some games like that just end up lost to time, you know? It's just people don't remember them. But yeah, the final point, you know, I'd like to just go ahead and bring us to today, is that, like, you know, that you know, the point that might help us to identify this the best, honestly, in my opinion, is actually determining the name of the game. Because the thing is, like, actually coming up with the name and being it, or just not even the name, just a name to be able to associate with it, that will make it so much easier to find. Like, and again, like, as I stated before, towards the start of all this, the words sword, spell, and frontier really seem to stick out to me upon, like, me trying to recollect all of this. And perhaps, like, you know, it's like, you know, some combination of those words ultimately are what, you know, make the actual title, like the true title. You know, and again, like, maybe it's not even those words, maybe it's synonyms or like similar words to, you know, those three particular words. You know, it's like, it could be like, you know, sword and spell frontier, frontier of swords and spells. It could be I don't know, it could be like continent of blades and magicka or something, you know what I mean? Like, I truly don't know, and I've done several searches, but I guess there's still a lot more that I could do in terms of searches. Honestly, right now I'm gonna go ahead and just like throw a table of like words and different like associated words up, and it's like some combination of that, like, that's got to be something that's going to give us like a good trail to sort of go on here. It's like if the gameplay description and like some of the characters and stuff of the game aren't enough to like get us there, I'm hoping at least we can like throw some name combinations around and maybe find something. Because like, yeah, I mean, yeah, it's tricky. It's tricky. But yeah, I'm hoping if anything, like combining some of these words and then doing some more searches, you know, based on that, will hopefully be like, I don't know, if we could just find the title that sticks, it's going to be like the catalyst to finding out so much more about this lost game. You know what I mean? So, but yeah, now comes to the finale, the conclusion, the ending, if you will, of our our very long-winded discussion on a game that is unknown or doesn't even like, I would not want to think that it doesn't exist, because the thing is, I couldn't have rambled on for as long as I have about something like that. You know what I mean? Like, that is a long time to ramble. You know what I mean? So, like, but no, now is the time that I'm going to ask you, the viewer, you know, whoever of you actually managed to stick through to the end of this, into today's, you know, discussion, today's relic hunt, if you will. If you happen to know anything about this game, that could, you know, that could possibly lead us to like some understandings here, some insight, and what it could possibly be named, literally just any additional insight that you might have that you could provide in this manner, like, please, like, leave a comment. Like, I really want to hear from you. Not only that, but like, I guarantee, like, if you leave a comment about like what you think this game is, like, I will, like, I mean, I'll respond. Like, I plan to like respond to pretty much every comment that's, you know, actually directing, you know, that's actually cooperating in this hunt here. Like, you know, I'll respond to every comment, and I will read every comment, because I want to know what this game's about, man. Like, I cannot for the life of me remember, and I really want to know, because like, I want, not only that, but like, I want to find it so that I can play it again and then like do a reassessment of it. Like, that's the thing that I want to do. I want to like just like figure it out and then reassess like the game. Like, that's what I want to do. So like, there's very well, like, if we can actually find that game, like if we find this game based on today's long discussion here, like, I'm hoping to do a second like follow-up video of like, it might even just be like a playthrough of it at that point. But like, I would love to be able to like actually do like a follow-up to this video where we actually do play that, and like, I give my opinions on it now that it's the good old year of like 2023, and you know, you know, because a game from the early 90s is still relevant in the good old year of 2023. Oh goodness. But yeah, like I said, yeah, please leave a comment if you know anything. Like, I really want to know. I really want to know if you know anything, you know? It's like you might think that, like, I don't know. I mean, you know, it's too early right now to be able to really make too many guesses based off of like, you know, my ramblings. But like, yeah, I'm hoping that there's at least one person that listens to this that like knows something. You know what I mean? Like, I would absolutely love if that's the case. But yeah, I mean, you know, not only that, but like, even if you don't know anything about it and are just interested in trying to find it, like, hey, be my guest. Like, I know I've been looking for a little bit. I mean, if some other people start getting involved with this too, and look around and, you know, try to find what they can on this, like, hey, you know what? It's like, you know, there's a strong possibility that we end up bringing back some kind of like a lost RTS game. You know, it's like some game that's been lost to time and just like, it's just been dead. Like, you know, it's like we might unintentionally revive a game, you know? It's like, and not only that, like a game that very well could be like a very like cool and early example of like what the RTS genre consisted of. You know what I mean? Like, that would be such a cool thing to come across, you know, just both from like me wanting to just like, I don't know, see a moment of the past, but like also from a greater standpoint of, you know, it's like, hey, you know, if this thing really has been lost and nobody knows what this thing is, like, hey, somebody might find it, and hey, now we have an entire new, you know, potential like niche game to play. You know what I mean? It's like a whole nother you know, I wouldn't say a whole nother Age of Empires, because Age of Empires is absolutely superior in every way to this game that I've been describing. But hey, you know what? People have rallied around like stranger games than what I've described before. So if anything, like, hey, I don't know, man. You know, it might be just a weird classic that comes back into the limelight, if you will. But I don't know, time will tell. I suppose the first thing is actually trying to figure out what this is and placing it, and yeah, more or less being able to even enjoy it at all, because right now we got nothing to really go off of, or at least I don't have much to go off of. Like a couple of names of characters that are wrong because I've looked them up and have not found anything. A few descriptions of gameplay mechanics, of which I am confident are mostly correct, but again, can't really say because can't really recall off the top of my head, because I don't know, why would I? It's been like ages now since I've even considered it. You know, or like not really considered it, because I've thought about it, but you know, actually doing anything about it. But yeah, it's just like, I don't know, I feel like this is like a really big mystery that, I don't know, I think would be fun for like the greater community as a whole to like jump on, because I really want to know, and I think that it would be really cool to bring back a game that a lot of people don't seem to remember. You know, and maybe it's a thing of like, because I mean, this happens to me a lot too, where it's like, okay, well, I didn't remember it, but there is a group of people that remember it. It's just like trying to find that group of people, you know? Or it's like, oh, okay, now that I know the name, it's like, oh, no, okay, it's obvious. I should have known that, you know? It's like, maybe it is something just a lot more obvious than what I think. But I honestly don't think so, because like I did a lot of searching, and like I didn't really uncover too much in particular. Like I really couldn't find much. Like there were a couple of like, you know, like sort of like the forgotten gems of gaming, like some like topics in that line. It's like some of what people described on there kind of sounded familiar, but like there were definitely differences. And you know, even then, a lot of those types of discussions don't really pan out either. It's more or less just like people proposing an idea of something that could have existed, you know? And it's like, I don't know. None of them sounded like what I'm describing. And I don't think that I really have too much of a lead yet. But yeah, like I said, I'll absolutely be doing a follow-up video to this one. Like I would absolutely love to do that. I really hope that again, I mean, if you've listened this long, then obviously you're here for the long run, but now I hope this video was well received. Like I absolutely want to do a follow-up based on like any comments and any additional searching that I do. I definitely want to do like a follow-up to this. But yeah, if you'd like to stay up to date though on that, and kind of like, you know, keep track of where this goes, hey, you know, like I said, you know, feel free to like the video here, then subscribe. You know, join the good old Coop operatives. You know, stay on top of any of the good old Coop Couch happenings. You know, as they happen, and also like a lot of our updates and stuff that we post here on the channel. A lot of those end up on the Halls of the Jubilant subreddit. Again, that's the Halls of the Jubilant. So honestly, any of the updates that I come across, like I'll be posting stuff as I kind of like come across it. So if I do uncover anything between now and whenever we do a follow-up video, like it'll most likely be going to our subreddit. But yeah, honestly, I mean, and even then, we do a lot of stuff on there. You know, it's like, you know, we post, like I said, you know, either me or even some of the other Coop operatives, you know, post some updates. You know, and a lot of memes, a lot of funs. You know, just have a lot of fun overall in the subreddit. So, hey, feel free to check it out. And yeah, thanks for coming by. I know it's been a bit of a long one, but I hope that it's at least been somewhat entertaining, or at least somewhat informative. Granted, informative on something that I don't even have a name for, so, you know, take that for what it's worth. But no, thanks again to all you Coop operatives out there for dropping by, as well as anybody else that happened to join me on the couch today. And I shall see you guys next time. Talk to y'all soon, and bazo.